When we go out photographing with our phones in everyday situations, or whether it's for something a little bit more professional, we hold our phones up, we choose whether or not we want to photograph in portrait or landscape, we compose the shot how we feel, and we press that button and we capture the image. Now, we do all of this without ever really thinking about it. It kind of almost just becomes natural at this stage. We've got a certain natural intuition for how we want our photographs to be captured. But what we don't realize sometimes is what we're actually photographing through is something that is capable of seeing much wider than we're able to see. And that is our camera's lens. Our lens is the view of the world through our smartphones, and understanding this will help you to achieve much better quality photographs. Let's dig into lesson number 2. We're talking about lenses and accessories and attachments that we can use rather than just our inbuilt lenses. So our first topic is how lenses work. We're going to break down, just like we did in our first lesson with our phones, we're going to break down how our lenses actually work as well, as this will give you a better understanding of what to look for if you are thinking about purchasing a new lens, and what your own lens is capable of as well. So just common terms to get familiar with. We're going to have a look at the elements, our aperture again, we'll talk about angle of view, focal length, the difference between optical zoom and digital zoom as well. So first off, I want you to answer me this question. What do you think is the angle of human vision? So try this, look straight forward, okay, and think about how much you're actually able to see. What do you think is the actual angle of vision? Is it 90 degrees? Is it 130 degrees? Is it 160 degrees? Or is it 180 degrees? How much do you think you can actually see when you look forward? Okay, so what answer do you think it is? Just type it into Morpheus there and let us know. So if you said the angle of human vision is 130 degrees, you're absolutely right. Now, it varies ever so slightly. It is within that kind of range of about 130 to roughly 150 degrees. And when you think about it, when you look straight forward, when you look straight ahead, you can still see to the sides. You can still see, if you were to hold your hands up to the side of your head, you get a sense of where your hands are because of your peripheral vision. This is our vision that we've developed to it's a survival instinct, really. It's a survival sense, so that we're aware of what's happening around us. But if you actually think about what the focused part of our vision is, well, how many degrees do you think that is? So our full field of vision is somewhere in the range of 130 degrees. But if you think about exactly what you're looking at ahead of you, it's a much narrower field of vision, and that is in the region of 50 degrees. So when we look straight ahead and we're focusing on something, what's in focus to our eyes is in the region of 50 degrees. And this translates very much into our lenses as well. Now, if we were to look at a full range of lenses for a standard DSLR camera, going all the way from our fisheye up to a 600mm lens, we can see that as our focal length increases, our angle of vision becomes much narrower. So a fisheye lens, 180 degrees angle of vision, is actually much wider than what we're capable of seeing. It's not until we get to our 14mm that we're within a range that's within our field of vision, but that also includes our peripheral vision. So when we're photographing with these very wide lenses, because we're so used to only being focused on typically what's right in front of our eyes and in the center, we can sometimes forget to look at the edges. So anytime you're taking a photograph using a wide angle lens, which is what's found in our phones, always be sure to check around the edges as well, so that there's no unwanted surprises afterwards after you've taken your photograph, and then suddenly you see somebody who's just walked into the edge of the frame, or a car has just come into the edge of the frame, and so on. So always be sure when you're composing your photograph just to run your eyes around the edges of the frame as well. Now, if we're to look specifically at our phones lenses are much more limited. Typically, they will range in and around 25 to 70 degrees with the inbuilt lens. Okay, now we can get attachments, as we're going to see, to make our lenses wider. We can get attachments to add more zoom to our lenses, which will make our field of vision a lot narrower. But in a general range, it is quite broad. It is around 25 to 70 degrees. And the kind of sweet spot, I suppose, for most lenses is in around the 40 degree mark. Okay, so be aware of this again. If we compare this to our field of vision, and indeed our focused field of vision, the majority of lenses are wider than our focused field of vision. So I've mentioned focal length a lot, and we saw there was lenses, they had millimeters, like our fisheye lens was very wide. We had a 14 millimeter lens, we had a 600 millimeter lens. Why is it measured in millimeters? Where does that come from, and what does that mean? Well, that is our focal length. And there is a point in the lens where the image comes into focus. So when the light enters into our lens and is projected onto our image sensor size is also a factor here, but when it's projected onto our sensor, that distance between where the image is focused, measured from the image sensor, is where we get those millimeters. Now, within phones, because phones are so small, anytime you see millimeters written, it's an equivalency. It's an equivalency to a full frame camera, a standard DSLR camera. Okay, so for example, when we see 22 millimeters, if that's the distance between the point where the image comes into focus measured to the image sensor, on our phones, it's unlikely that there's going to be 22 millimeters of room in such a small space. So it's an equivalency. The main takeaway from this, because I know it's a bit more of a difficult thing to understand, the main thing to understand is the lower the millimeter, the wider the lens and the angle of view is. So say, for example, a 10 millimeter lens is going to be much, much wider than a 100 millimeter lens. Okay, so the lower the millimeters, the wider the lens, the higher the millimeters, the more zoomed in the lens is going to be. Now, inside of our lenses, it also houses the aperture, which we saw in lesson 1 is an opening within the lens that allows light to pass through and reach our image sensor. It controls the volume of light that is coming in to the image sensor. It also controls depth of field as well. And as we saw, it cannot be changed, unlike on a camera. Now, looking into aperture a little bit more, if we think about everything to do with lenses, it very much works the exact same way as our eyes. And when we speak about our eyes, if we think about the pupils in particular, our pupils will change depending on the light available. If we need more light, our pupils get wider. If we need less light, our pupils constrict. We know this as dilation and constriction. So in image 1 here, you can see it's shot in the studio first of all, because you can see that umbrella there, lots of bright light there. But just that bit farther away, that the pupil is able to dilate so that it allows more light into the eye. And this is what allows us to see in lower light situations. This is what allows us to see in the dark, more or less. When we look at image number 2, we know that it's very, very bright because we know that the pupil is a lot smaller. And if you think about this, say you're in a very, very dark room. Okay, your eyes will adjust to that dark room, but if you open the door and say you step outside into very bright sunlight, for a couple of moments you cannot see because everything's far too bright, because your eyes have not adjusted yet. They haven't constricted, the pupil hasn't gotten smaller, so you're completely overwhelmed until the muscles in your eye make the pupil a little bit smaller. This is the exact way our apertures work in our cameras as well. So in a standard lens, our aperture will go wider and smaller. We can control it to change the volume of light coming in. So the wider the aperture, more light that comes in. It also creates a shallow depth of field. If we want a smaller aperture, this restricts the light and it deepens our depth of field. Now, on a phone, our aperture is fixed. So what good is knowing this? What good is it to know whether an aperture gets wider or smaller, to let more light in, to let less light in, and create a shallow depth of field or a deep depth of field? Well, we still have a certain amount of control over our apertures, and understanding again the limitations of our phones will allow us to figure out ways on how to overcome this. And a lot of smartphone manufacturers have already taken the initiative on this to find other ways to create depth of field. Now, just a little bit of vocabulary to go around with our apertures as well. So as I mentioned before, apertures are expressed as f numbers or f-stop. So we're going to see, for example, f1.4 or f2.2 or f5.6, f8, f11, f22, etc. The lower the f-stop number, the wider the aperture is. That's the thing to remember here, is that the lower the number, the wider the aperture is, or the higher the number, the smaller the opening on the lens. Okay, so smaller number, wider aperture, higher number, smaller aperture. Now, a lower f-stop also means we get a shallower depth of field. Now, at this stage, you're probably wondering, what is the aperture on my phone? Well, the standard aperture on most phones is f2.4. Now, due to the size of the sensor, which is also a factor, this is the equivalent of f13 on a 35mm sensor or a full frame camera. Now, 35mm is the standard because this was the size of 35mm film that was primarily used throughout the 20th century, and indeed now we've got 35mm image sensors, which are also still considered the standard that everything is essentially measured from. So f2.4, while it may seem very, very wide in terms of it being on our phones, it is actually a mid-range aperture, much more suited for landscapes. And a part of this then as well, one of the reasons that we have this type of aperture on our phones is that it also keeps things that little bit sharper too. So, primarily we want to try and keep things nice and sharp in our images. If we want to achieve depth of field, there are ways to do that, which we're going to have a look at in lesson number 4. And I'll also explain where the F comes from in lesson number 4. A little bit complicated, a little bit more advanced for this lesson. But if you Google your own phone's specifications, you'll be able to see exactly what f-stop is being used on your lens. Now, the final two things then just to speak about in terms of our camera lenses are optical zoom and digital zoom, and what the difference is between the two of them. Optical zoom is the lens itself will zoom in and out. So some lenses have the ability to be able to zoom in and zoom out on an image, and that actually happens through a mechanism in the lens itself. It means we can change from a wide angle to a more zoomed in angle. So from a wide angle to a more zoomed in angle of view, I should say there, so that we can get a little bit closer to our subject, and is usually measured as 3x or 5x or 10x and so on. And that means, for example, if I have a 22mm lens and I have a 3 times optical zoom, it'll max zoom up to 66mm because it's multiplied by 3. Optical zoom will maintain the quality of your image, and that's the biggest difference with it compared to our digital zoom. Digital zoom is when we're actually zooming in on the pixels of our image itself. So this means that, as you can see here, like in the example, we're getting in onto the pixels itself. It's like we're cropping into the image to achieve zoom. More pixels will mean a better digital zoom, but you will lose quality when you use digital zoom, and it should only ever be used as a last resort if you really need to capture that photograph, or there's just something in the distance that you just have to capture. Digital zoom will help you to capture it, but you're going to sacrifice quality. Now, so that's everything that we need to know about the inside of our lenses for now. Let me ask you a question now. This is a tough one, so I'd be very impressed if you know the answer to this. What is so important about this photograph? Obviously, it's a photograph of a newborn baby. What's so significant about it? This picture has a place in history, and it's a tough one. I'll give you a hint. It's something to do with the advancement of technology, and stick around to the end of the lesson to find out exactly what is so important about this photograph. And no looking it up in the meantime. See if you can guess it, or maybe you already know the answer to this. Maybe you have seen this image before. Now, as usual, for our next topic, which we're going to have a look at, our built-in lenses. This means the lenses that are available to us within our phones, the ones that are there pre-packaged essentially when we first unbox our phone. Now, there's three types of inbuilt lenses. Most phones will typically just have one lens, which is our standard lens, but some phones will have two, and much more higher end phones now have three lenses. These are typically a wide and a telephoto lens. So let's break down each of these. So let's start off by having a look at our standard lens. This is the one that's going to be available to the majority of us out there. Our standard lens, designed for everyday photography. It is typically a wide angle lens, not as wide as our super wide lenses. Our fixed aperture, as we've well established at this stage, but we will be able to recreate that in some other ways. Great for landscapes and portraits and everyday photography. It's a general purpose lens. It will cover nearly everything that we encounter in our day-to-day lives. It's also really good for macro and food. We just have to get in physically closer with our smartphones, and we get a good macro and food photograph. Combine that with the modes, the features that we had a look at in the last lesson, and you should get some really good results. It's not great for wildlife or sports. It is limited here because typically for those types of photographs we need to be a lot closer to the action, and we can struggle when we're using a standard lens. And it's not good for low light photographs in most cases without a flash or a tripod, as we're going to see in our low light photography lesson. So like this image here, we can get good results, but we will need a flash in most cases. Again, this is because of the limit of our aperture. But attachments are available, of course, as we'll have a look at later on in this lesson, so that we can add zoom, or we can make our lens even wider if needs be. Now, our next lens to have a look at is our super wide lens, if you're lucky enough to have more than one lens in your camera. And this is much wider than our standard lens, the one that we saw previously. We have a much wider angle of view, which makes it great for landscapes and architectural photographs in particular. It's a blessing for group shots as well. So if you're doing any kind of wide shots, like say for example you happen to be at a wedding and you have to capture a large group, it's great for that type of photograph as well. Again, not great for wildlife or sports. It doesn't mean that you can't use it for wildlife or sports. You're just going to get a different type of photograph. Again, as I mentioned, typically we want to be that little bit closer to the action when it comes to wildlife and sports. Aperture is typically a higher f-stop than the standard lens. So when we're changing through our lenses on our camera phones, they will have different f-stops available to them. They're not all going to use the same f-stop. And typically on a super wide lens, it's a higher f-stop. In other words, it's a higher f number. And this is because we're trying to maintain a deep depth of field, because primarily wide angle lenses are used for landscapes where we want to keep everything nice and sharp the whole way through the image. This means a greater depth of field. It utilizes less of a sensor, so megapixel count will be less. So one of the things that we're going to see is that with our inbuilt lenses, as we change through them, if we have that option available to us, that they will actually use less megapixels. Our standard lens, our primary lens, will use all the pixels available to us on our sensor, but our other lenses will actually use a smaller amount of the sensor, meaning that we're going to have a smaller megapixel. But again, this will be indicated in the lens, as we're going to have a look at in an example in just a moment. Then we have our telephoto lens. This is typically the third lens available to us in our inbuilt lenses, and this means it's much more zoomed in. Telephoto means that we have a narrower angle of view, much narrower angle of view, but it means we're much closer to our subject. This is great for portraits and for creating a shallow depth of field. One of the factors to getting a good depth of field is distance. So if we actually get closer to our subject, we can create a shallow depth of field. And this means that if we're using a telephoto lens for portraits, because we're closer to our subject, we get a nice shallow depth of field. Really good for macro, wildlife and sports photography. Not great for low light without a flash in most cases. And again, this is because our aperture is a higher f-stop, and this is unlike our wide angle lens where we're trying to keep everything nice and sharp. This is actually just down to a physical limitation. Because our telephoto lens has a narrower field of view, the aperture is actually going to be a higher f number, and it uses even less megapixels on a sensor than compared to our other two previous lenses, because it is much more zoomed in. So there's just another type of lens to mention very, very briefly, which is our dual lenses. Now, this can be a little bit confusing compared to our other lenses. When you see a camera like this, it doesn't necessarily mean that you've got the choice to switch between two different lenses. What it actually means is that we have an option of taking a photograph using two lenses at the same time. There's a very particular reason for this. So it's usually a wide angle lens. It's designed with two purposes in mind. One is to recreate depth of field, and the other is to improve autofocus. Okay, so it typically will use something known as PDAF, which is phase detection autofocus, where it's able to gauge the depth of our subject, how far away our subject is, and get a much better autofocus. Because it's using two lenses, slightly different angles, it can actually gauge that distance a lot better. So this means that both lenses will take a photograph. They're combined together for greater sharpness. It also, through this process, can defocus an image to create a depth of field effect. So one lens is going to capture your sharp image. The other lens is going to capture a slightly out of focus image. Combine them together to create a depth of field effect. So that is our dual lenses. We will come back to them when we have a look at depth of field in greater detail in lesson number 4. But I suppose the basic idea is, if you've ever seen what's known as a stereoscopic image, this is an image going all the way back to kind of Victorian times, where they had an image that you looked at using two lenses, almost like a pair of glasses, and it created this kind of 3D effect. Similarly with 3D as well, where you've kind of got this overlay of images. It is very much a similar concept, a similar design to that. Now, let's have a look at an example. So here we've got a Huawei, one of their more high-end phones, and these are the specs here on the camera. So let's break it down. So first of all, we've got a triple camera setup. Now you can see 4 lenses on it. So we've got 3 cameras, but we have a dual lens as well. So on top of having our 3 cameras, we also have a dual lens like we just saw, and that is on our standard lens. Our primary lens, which is our standard one, is 40 megapixels. It has a good wide aperture in this case of f1.6. We've got optical image stabilization, and we have a 27mm equivalent focal length, which is very wide for a standard lens in particular. So we've got a good wide aperture, f1.6. We have a 27mm focal length. Our telephoto lens, as you can see, uses much less megapixels, 8 megapixels. So a fifth indeed of what our primary lens is using. Now, folded optics means that it's a special type of optics within it to create that telephoto effect. And as you can see, our aperture value is much higher. That means that we're going to get a greater depth of field and much less light coming in. So we'll have to compromise that with our shutter and our ISO. Again, we've got an optical stabilizer. and it's much greater zoom on it. We've got 125mm equivalent focal length, which is a very powerful zoom, so very, very good for, as I mentioned, our sports, wildlife and our portrait. Finally then, our super wide, it's 20 megapixels, half the amount of pixels compared to our primary lens, with an aperture of f2.2, quite a standard aperture range, and it's a 16mm, so nearly twice as wide as our 27mm. So again, very, very wide. So you've got really good options there within this particular example, the Huawei, but it's very, very expensive as well. So this is the downside to it. You've got very good options, very good range there. On top of, there's a heap of features available in it, but it's also very, very pricey. So this is unfortunately the downside to this. When you want a smartphone that does nearly everything, has all of these lenses, you're going to be paying a lot more for it. But don't fret, because in a moment we'll have a look at how you can use attachments instead to achieve these results. Before we do that, I just wanted to show you very, very quickly what we're going to be covering in lesson number 3. So coming up in the next lesson, it is all about composition. So we're going to move away from our technical stuff for a little while. We're going to have a look purely at the creative aspect of our photography. Composition means we can just focus on taking a picture and looking and seeing and enjoying our photography without worrying about all the technical stuff. Our final topic for this lesson are our lens attachments. So rather than forking out a lot of money for a brand new camera phone like the Huawei with lots of lenses inbuilt to it, it is also possible for us to simply buy lenses that we can attach to our phones. We've got two ways we can attach to them. Most popular way is the clip way, as you can see here in the demonstration, but it is also possible to buy a little attachment that's a screw that will go onto your camera lens, and you can then screw in different types of lenses as well. The cost ranges as low as €10 all the way to €100 plus. Don't expect to get something for high quality for €10, but if you are just looking to have a little bit of fun, or you want to pick up a gift for somebody to try out, it's well worth us checking them out. I had a small range of lenses in around that price, and I had a good bit of fun with them. So do check it out if you want to try before you buy. Lots of recommended brands out there, just a couple I mentioned here, but there's just so many, like you really won't have an issue finding any. Manfrotto brand we had a look at with tripods, they actually do a really good range of lenses as well, but they are a little bit more on the pricier side of things, and you can buy them anywhere, Amazon, eBay and your local camera shop. You really should not have any problem picking these up in the modern era. But again, you could always go into your local camera shop. I always recommend it so you can try before you buy. Now let's have a look at the different ones available to us, starting off with our super wide. So we'll go wide first of all and work our way up to there. So super wide for doing wide landscape photographs, designed for all-round use. And these will give you an angle of view that is wider than your standard lens. They range from a 10 to 20mm equivalent, which is very, very wide. Good all-rounder for landscapes, for people, for street photography as well. If you're into doing a bit of street photography, it's a good lens type to start with. Keeps everything usually nice and sharp. Gives you a good ability to crop into your photographs as well if you have a decent amount of megapixels. It is available as a clip-on, but you can also buy that little screw mount attachment if you prefer as well. Next up is our telephoto lenses, and these are suitable, as you can see, for doing something like wildlife photography here. And these are interesting. As you can see, there's quite a lot in these little lenses. They come in different ranges. They come from a 5x to a 20x range. The more range that you have, they will also come with that little tripod attachment as well, as you can see there in the photograph, just to help keep things steady. It is something that you need to be a little bit more aware of when you're photographing with telephoto lenses, is that they are more susceptible to getting camera shake. They range from as wide as 24mm all the way up to a 400mm equivalent, which is a pretty hefty zoom, and will certainly get you closer in terms of sports, wildlife. And as I mentioned before, these lenses are also very, very good for portrait photography. Just remember that if you are using them for portrait photography, just to take a couple of steps back away from your subject and then zoom in, and they will give you a nice perspective. Aperture ranges will vary, but with telephoto lenses, you're typically going to have a very tight aperture range, but again, depth of field can be achieved with telephoto lenses the closer to the subject that you get. Some will have a zoom option, meaning that you can actually change the range. You can zoom in and out with them. So they'll have a range of say 5 to 10, which means you can start at 5 times optical zoom and zoom into 10 times optical zoom. And as I've said before, some will also include a little tripod to help keep your image steady. And as I mentioned as well, telephoto lenses are more prone to camera shake. Next up is a very popular one is our macro lenses. And macros, as I've mentioned before, smartphones in particular are very good for macro photography, but they're essentially a magnifier, like a magnifying glass that your granny would have used to help her to read, or your granddad even. And it's essentially the same idea. You know, it's just magnifying the lens, designed to increase your minimal focus distance. In other words, you can get closer into your subject and maintain focus. It's something you may have noticed already with your smartphones when you're trying to do macro photography, is that you get to a point where you're too close and the lens can no longer focus. That means you've gone beyond your minimal focus distance. So these will help to increase that. And as I've just mentioned there, that's how close the lens can get before it can no longer focus. Good for food, flowers, insects. Macro photography is great for doing a little bit of abstract photography as well, focusing on things like shapes and textures and so on. And like telephotos, they come in 5x, 10x, 15x, like you can see in the example here. But that is an increase in the magnification. It's not the increase in focal length. So like a 15x macro lens will magnify your lens by 15 times, allowing you to get 15 times closer to a subject, which is significant. Now, if you're really into your portrait photography, it is possible to get dedicated portrait lenses like this 85mm, which technically falls in the telephoto range, designed, as you would guess, for portraits. The range from about 50 to 100mm. That kind of focal length is the range for portraits, although you can go beyond that as well. But typically, that is kind of our sweet spot. 60 to 85mm is considered the optimal range. 85mm in particular is a very popular portrait lens. I have one myself. Just gives you a nice perspective, nice proportions on the face, and allow you to just keep that little bit of distance that you need if you're after those kind of candid shots as well. Closeness to the subject will help to increase that depth of field effect, and they can be quite pricey. Good portrait lenses can end up being a little bit more expensive for higher quality ones. As you can see here as well, we've got more of the screw-on type of attachment here rather than the clip-on as well. And finally then, a very, very fun lens is our fisheye lens. Very distinct lens, as you can see here in the photograph. Very curved edges, giving it that name, that fisheye effect. And these, as I mentioned, these are really fun lenses to use. The focal length is less than 10mm. So much wider than our super wide lenses. As you can see in this one, it's 7.5mm. We've got that very distinct curved lens shape, and it gives us that very distinct photograph. Heavily distorted circular shape, which can actually be corrected afterwards as well through post-production. It's actually a really fun lens to start with. You can pick these up for quite cheap, and just have a bit of fun with them straight away. Can't be used for anything really. It is a fun lens to play with, but I do find them quite limited for really professional use. So I mean, I wouldn't be looking to do something like portraiture or architecture using one of these types of lenses, but they're really good for doing sports, kind of extreme sports, and even kind of music photography and that as well, because they have an association with that type of photography too. Now when I say limited though, it really is up to you. You are the photographer. You make the choice and you make the decision about what lenses you want to use. I'm merely just giving you suggestions. Now, so earlier on, I asked a question about this photograph. Why is this photo so important? And well, It's a historical photograph because it was the first photograph captured by a camera phone. So all the way back in 1997, taken by Philippe Kahn, who was developing the first camera phone. The first camera phone wasn't actually released until 1999, and it was exclusively in Japan. But this was the first photograph captured on the camera phone, and even then it was instantly shared with more than 2,000 people around the world via email. So very significant photograph of Philippe Kahn's newborn daughter at the time, back in 1997, taken with the first camera phone. So there's an interesting one for you. So that is the end of our lesson. So coming up in lesson 3, we're going to talk all about composition. We're going to have a look at different angles, different perspectives. We're going to have a look at engaging more with your subject, and just how you can generally use guidelines to compose better photographs and things to look out for to make your photographs more interesting and more engaging. It's a much less technical lesson, so if you found some of the content a little bit technical in the last 2 lessons, we're going to be moving away from that and just into a much more creative area to develop our creative skills.
Please subscribe, like and share.